So as we jump in for tonight, as you're coming in and getting settled, just a thank you for being here. As you know, these sessions are all dedicated to support people that are involved in our research activities as part of two studies. One is the randomized control trial that's taking place in the state of South Carolina and Washington, as well as our advanced implementers here in Kansas, as well as in Vermont. So we appreciate you being here. So tonight we are focusing at the top of the triangle in terms of tier 3. And one of the things that we're going to do today, as we talk about where we're at in this series, is our focus is on tier 3. But we want to illustrate tonight how everything that we do at tier 3 is building on the work that we do at tier 1. And that cannot be overstated enough. And if we were thinking about doing tier 3 interventions for students, we would not want to do those in optimal conditions isolated from the practices that are happening at tier 1. Next time that we were together, we are going to have one more session this year that will be in April, and we're going to be putting a bow on the end of this year. We'll be talking about how to use these enhanced resources to wrap up this year and how to use those for the year ahead. Mark and I had a meeting with some district leaders this morning, and it was really cool. One of the things that they shared that they were doing is that their principals and CI3T leadership teams asked for dedicated time in their district-wide PD days to interact with the modules. And specifically, they asked for their top 5 priorities to become the foundational pieces of their district-wide PDs. And they shared some cool ways that they're using these resources. So we'll share a bit of those with you. If you want anything that you have tonight that is available to you, this is session 5. If you go on to the enhanced page with this password, which I think many of you have been in several times, and Mark was showing me today that we have over 3,000, is that right, Mark? 3,000 people that have logged in and have been interacting with these modules over the course of this year thus far. So super excited to hear how those are going for you. But tonight's resources specifically will be there. And what we're going to do is we're going to have just a short little bit of time. We're going to situate this information as to where this is fitting in your system. And we'll talk a little bit about the data-informed decision-making that you do so elegantly. And secondly, we are going to then talk about 2 different approaches for tier 3. We're going to be focusing on how to support kids with externalizing behavior patterns. And we're going to focus tonight on the acting out cycle. And then we're also going to talk about the new suite of resources for supporting kids with internalizing issues and talk about how to work across the tiers for doing that. And then we're going to just show you where some other resources are as you move forward. So again, if this is interesting to you and you want it, and my sincere thanks to Eric for putting that in the chat. He put the link and the password. So you are welcome to log in and access these resources if you want it. And one of the things that I do want to mention is that although we're talking about these separately, like supports for externalizing and internalizing, we want to extend that gentle reminder that these are not completely siloed. And when you look at the percentage of kids in the United States that are struggling with internalizing issues, shy, anxious, withdrawn, that is a large group of kids that have internalizing issues as well as externalizing, and there's a moderate degree of overlap. About 25% of the kids tend to have challenges in both domains, although as teachers, the things that are often most quick to capture our attention are acting out behaviors that Mark's going to talk about today. But I do want to remind you that there are, for many kids, underneath all that anger and frustration is also this, and nobody likes me, and this anxious feeling and feeling socially withdrawn. So I appreciate your commitment to engaging in a system that prioritizes academics, behavior, and social and emotional well-being in one integrated system. And one of the things I love most about this day, this topic, these resources, this really is an opportunity to celebrate the fact that you have a system in place that deals with kids' multiple needs in one integrated fashion. And you guys have fully committed, well beyond, before the pandemic and through these years, to not giving up on addressing the entire student's needs. And you're going to see how we talk about these strategies and practices and programs, about how these work together to support kids' multiple needs. And I want to recognize that we are celebrating tonight all the partnerships that we have across the United States, and also recognizing that this has been in place, the beginnings of CI3T, since 1997. And positive behavior intervention and support is at the core, but we have consistently wrapped around academics as well as social and emotional well-being into one integrated model. And something that Wendy said at the end of our last night session with the traditional materials is the fact that we also want to engage in systems that are important and in terms of taking care of teachers' well-being. And a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about tonight, it could be information points that we can also use to support our faculty and staff in our buildings and in our districts to engage comfortably in school and take good care of themselves. So some of you have seen this graphic before, and we are really lucky that we have the opportunity to have funding from the Institute of Education Sciences, and we were able to design this so that all the seasoned implementers that are in Kansas and in Vermont, we get to continue learning, and we have this opportunity to see not only what's happening with students, but how it's impacting teacher well-beings. And some of you are also here tonight from South Carolina and from Washington that are involved in a randomized control trial. So as we situate this work, although we're talking about the top of the triangle, we want to make some clarities about remembering the importance of being first clear on what's happening at Tier 1 and looking at the data that you have, to see, is Tier 1 indeed happening as planned? So in the pages of the manuals that you've built that solidify all the details of your plans for everybody at Tier 1 and Tier 2 and Tier 3, we want to make sure that Tier 1 practices are in place. So I know that you've been doing work to introduce those low intensity supports to the students in your building through their teachers' use of these strategies. So you're teaching teachers how to do pre-correction. You're teaching teachers how to do behavior-specific praise. And you're building fluency in those components. And that's important because tonight, when Mark is sharing these new resources with you, you're going to see that timing of these is very important, and we need to have teachers and others have fluency in how to do those, because those become the building blocks that constitute the rest of these interventions. So these things that you've been doing for years using the old materials, and as you know, you've got souped up versions of those now, and you also have that whole plan in your reactive plan. Many of you have this flow chart that explains like that 6-step instructional approach, and this has been a popular module that begins with showing a student empathy and maintaining the flow of instruction. And you're going to see where it becomes particularly important in the acting out cycle. And of course, you've got your wonderful commitment to using your validated resources to address student well-being, which is where you're teaching them things like empathy and managing their own emotions and identifying them and getting along with others. And collectively, this is what we teach, and this is what we're acknowledging, and this is how we're using data to shape instruction. Wendy Oakes and Mark Buckman and Katie Lane are working on an article for our funders group all about this integrated lesson plan and how it can conceptually pull all these pieces together so that people, not just us as adults, but so we can communicate to kids how it all fits together throughout their daily instruction. And just had a great conversation this morning with the district that they're talking about how to weave these in at the high school level so that they can help their teachers to know that these are the things that you can use to help kids engage in new curriculum and new instruction. And I know many of you are in the thick of getting ready to do, and some of you have already started your treatment integrity and social validity windows, which is going to be great because we want to make sure that we're connecting with care. And by that, I mean, we don't want to say to a family that their child needs more than Tier 1 has to offer, or in the form of Tier 2 or Tier 3, if we're not sure that Tier 1's in place. And before we jump into this, I want to remind people of just 2 quick things. There are no Tier 2 kids. There are no Tier 3 kids. There are students for whom Tier 1 was not enough. And so we're going to wrap these supports around them. And secondly, and importantly, our big topic tonight is working at the top of the triangle. But we want to emphasize a student doesn't have to go first to Tier 2 to get to Tier 3. It's entirely possible that some kids are going to go directly to Tier 3 if they're exposed to multiple risk factors and they have that need. So we want to use our data well to first see, like, is Tier 1 in place? And I love looking at these schools' journey. These are some of the data from schools that we're working with right now, that when they started in 2014, they had work to do at Tier 1. And you can see that they have really grown the green, as you would say, in terms of not just externalizing, but also internalizing behavior patterns. They've seen growth. There is still, of course, room for improvement, but I'm in a much better space right now in these schools over the last 7 years to know that we're ready to really tackle some of the tier 2 and tier 3 considerations. So we're focusing at tier 3. You might think about this as building your library. And if you are logged in, and if you're not yet, please get there. We're gonna focus today on 2 different types of tier 2 supports. And these are rich resources. And the first one that we're going to start with is about supporting acting out issues. And then you're going to have time for some conversations. And then we're going to pause and have some time for internalizing issues. So not personally, but to go through these resources. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and Mark's going to cue it up on his end. And we're looking forward to some talk time with you in just a bit.
Cool. Thank you, Kathleen. I hope you all can see my screen. Perfect. Yeah. Okay. Great. So yeah, I'm going to cover this section on managing students or managing challenging behavior, particularly around the acting out cycle, which we often think about in terms of externalizing behaviors. Before we jump into the content, I just want to acknowledge a few things. The first is that the content from this section is really inspired from this book called Managing the Cycle of Acting Out Behavior in the Classroom by Jeff Colvin and Terry Scott. This is a really, really wonderful book that has provided a lot of insight in terms of how we think about students that engage in pretty challenging behavior and some of the ways that we can support those students in the most productive and positive manner possible. So if you hear things that you're really interested in tonight, that book would be a really good thing to take a look at. Also, as we go through the details of the acting out cycle, there is a professional learning module on our enhancingci3t.org website that's called Managing Acting Out Behavior at Tier 3. That module is going to contain all of the information that we're going to go through tonight and is available to you as a resource to access whenever you want to pull resources, content, reminders of the various topics that we'll talk about, etc., both for your use and for the use of your colleagues. So if you see things here that you like and you want to share with other people, know that all of those resources are right there for you, free to use and free to share with anyone that is in your school building. We do ask that you keep access to these module materials restricted just to people that you work with at your school to make sure that they're only going to people that have permission to use them right now. Eventually they'll be opened for the public to use, but right now it's sort of a special opportunity that you have. So definitely take advantage of those resources, and we'll show you a little bit more about what's in that module here in just a few minutes. Also, before I jump into it, I just want to remind you that this content is going to be recorded tonight in sort of a webinar format. So if you really wish that you had a couple of colleagues that were here to hear this, know that you can definitely share that YouTube link when it becomes available, probably in about 2 or 3 weeks, usually is how long it takes for those to get published. So definitely keep a lookout for that. So let's jump into the module first. You can go to ci3t.org/enhance, type in the password that Eric Common put in the chat just a few minutes ago, enhance ci3t ! And that's going to take you to this website where you will be actually able to download or access any one of a number of Enhancing CI3T professional learning modules, of which the one that we're going to look at tonight is called, of course, Managing Acting Out Behavior at Tier 3. You can find it by looking for this cute but very angry redhead girl on the cover. That cover is going to, when you click that, it'll take you to a little sign-in screen where you can access the module that we'll be looking at tonight. And in that, when you click that link, basically it's going to take you to this ebook format. Basically, it's a web page, and all the information that we'll be looking at tonight is going to be on that web page in sort of this book-like format, which is great, especially if you're looking for a really specific resource or a specific piece of information. The book makes it really easy to kind of jump around in the content to find just what you're looking for. However, if you're looking for more of a kind of a multimedia experience, something you can kick back and listen to, if you wanted to revisit anything that you heard here tonight, or if you wanted to even share this in a professional development with your colleagues at your school, you could use something called an interactive resource. Basically, it's a voiced over PowerPoint with various interactive features that you can actually just watch the entirety of this module as kind of almost like a movie kind of experience. There's a lot of information in this module. We call it kind of an advanced module because it has a lot of basic and advanced information in it for various people in your school implementing CI3T or supporting students with intensive intervention needs. But it's all right there. And everything that's in that book is also in that interactive resource. So you can really choose the way that you want to access this information in whatever way kind of seems most entertaining or conducive to your learning preferences there. So definitely keep in mind that those resources are there for you to use. And one of the resources that will show up in this module is an actual intervention grid. That's kind of like a really quick look at a glance at an intervention that you might use, building on an understanding of the acting out cycle and an individualized plan for a student that's going to be created as part of a collaborative process that includes the child themselves, likely family members, general education teachers, potentially any other adults in the school that might work with a student that has these challenging behaviors. This intervention grid is something that would go into your school's CI3T implementation manual to list that an individualized de-escalation plan is an available tier 3 resource at your school. So if that's something that's currently in your plan, the good news is this module would show you how you could start to implement this intervention for a student if you do have kids in your class or in your school that have those intensive needs. If this grid is not currently in your manual and you hear things tonight where you're like, man, I wish we had something in our school in place for kids with this kind of need, definitely take that to your CI3T leadership team. If you're a member, great, that's a good first step. If not, go to school leaders and say, hey, I learned about this strategy and this intervention type. Can we get this added to our plan to make sure it's something that everybody could use and learn about if they've got kids that might benefit from this type of intervention? So you can actually download a sample intervention grid to just copy and paste into your implementation manual. After this year, we do recommend you not edit your implementation manual mid-year, but as you're going through revision processes, or if you're giving feedback to your CI3T team and saying, hey, we need more tier 3 supports, you might recommend this one as one to add for next year. And as we start thinking about what the acting out cycle is, we want to start with this kind of conception of behavior in terms of, behaviors tend to happen when they're reinforced. So we'll often talk about, what exactly are the challenging behaviors that you're seeing in the class that cause this child to kind of flag in your screening data or in your discipline data as someone that's having a pretty substantial challenge with behavior. And what we'll do is we'll look at some of the consequences that are reinforcing those behaviors to kind of see, well, what are they getting out of this? Are they getting out of tasks that they don't want to do? Are they getting a lot of attention from their friends or from adults in the room? And that's going to be informative for thinking about how we can maybe minimize reinforcement for bad behaviors or for challenging behaviors, and start thinking about different things that child could do that might be more appropriate. So if a kid's getting a lot of attention for acting out, how can we teach them skills that would get them attention for doing the right thing instead? That's a big piece of kind of our behavioral support in general, but especially with this type of student that has these really large acting out behaviors. What we really want to do is we want to focus on prevention. And so when we talk about the ABCs of data, we're talking about antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. And I just spoke a little bit about consequences, but what we really want to do is we want to back it all the way up and think about, okay, what are the things that are happening when this child begins to engage in challenging behaviors? And how can we tweak the environment a little bit, maybe to prevent or minimize the impact of some of the things that are happening that might cause those behaviors to ramp up? Because oftentimes prevention is going to be the best way for us to support these students if we can prevent these challenging behaviors from happening in the first place. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today is about prevention and thinking about how we can change the antecedents or the environment that happens before a behavior occurs to hopefully kind of prevent these challenges from happening in the first place. And as we're thinking about, for what kinds of students might we be concerned about, that we might think about the acting out cycle and making an individualized de-escalation plan, we're probably thinking about students that have pretty severe challenging behavior. And the realities of schools right now is that there are quite a few students who might engage in these types of challenging behavior. Traditionally, a very small number of students have been actually served in special education for emotional disturbances. However, we know that quite a few more students than are actually served in special education for this kind of difficulty engage in difficult behaviors that might put them at risk for what we call an emotional and behavior disorder, or some kind of behavioral pattern that might interfere with their success at school. And this is particularly true now. So as we're thinking about this time in history, some of our colleagues on this call, actually, we did a survey a few years ago, right around the time the pandemic was happening. And we said, for people that are working in tiered systems in schools that are implementing CI3T, what kinds of support do you guys need the most? And the most frequently asked for professional development experience was exactly this: how to support students that engage in severe challenging behavior, and how to de-escalate students that are going through this acting out cycle. So we know that just kind of looking at the data for the number of kids that experience these kinds of challenges, and from what teachers are saying they need, this is really important content to be thinking about. So we're really glad that you're here to kind of get a taste for what this module has to offer, and hopefully a preliminary understanding of the acting out cycle. So what is the acting out cycle? You can see on your screen right now this cute little graphic that's got a red car and a road that's kind of going uphill and then downhill. And what this is it's a translation of a graphic that you could find in a couple of different books, including that book by Jeff Colvin and Terry Scott that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. Their graphic is sort of a simple line curve that goes up and then down. And we've kind of tried to flesh that out a little bit as kind of a metaphor, right? So we've got this car driving up the hill, and as it gets to the top of the hill, it literally catches on fire. And so this is kind of a metaphor for what happens, the sort of predictable pattern of behavior that can happen for students, and honestly, even sometimes adults, when we're having a crisis. So basically, as you're thinking about what this picture means, as you move from left to right, we're moving through time. And as the car goes up the hill, what we're seeing is an increasing intensity of behavior. And so what we think about when we're seeing a pattern of individuals going through sort of an escalated crisis cycle is that although most of our attention tends to be drawn to the most intense behavior, in schools, this is often things like elopement, physical aggression, property destruction. These are the things that when they happen, they cannot be ignored. They're really capturing our attention. Oftentimes, everybody up and down the hall in the school knows these things are happening. That's where our attention goes. But it's important to remember that those behaviors don't just come out of nowhere. And even if it kind of seems that way, there is a predictable pattern of behaviors that happened before that incident occurred. And it's really important to understand not just what's going on at the peak of the behavioral incident, but also what's happening before, and how potentially to get that individual to a de-escalated place. And so the true goal of what we're going to be thinking about as we learn about stages of the acting out cycle is how to provide what we're called like off ramps, right? So when challenging behavior occurs, it doesn't always escalate to a peak. Sometimes behaviors kind of naturally de-escalate because, circumstances just happen to go a certain way, and it doesn't kind of bring about this major incident. But sometimes what we have as educators is the opportunity to choose our own behaviors and how we can potentially shake things up a little bit and offer the child or the individual an off-ramp, a way to help them prevent the full escalation of those behaviors to the peak of the cycle. So basically, as we're going to be talking through the 7 stages of the acting out cycle, which are calm, trigger, agitation, acceleration, peak, de-escalation, and recovery, we're going to talk about what each of those look like, some strategies that you could use at each step along the way to either keep an individual at that stage or potentially to help give them an off-ramp, and some things to avoid. Because sometimes either by our decisions or just kind of as events unfold, those behaviors escalate. And so it's important to kind of think about what can we do to prevent the escalation from occurring. So those will be the big things that we'll be talking about tonight. And the really important piece of this is that escalated behavior is not an inevitability. It's something that we have efficacy to contribute either to de-escalation or potentially escalation based on our choices. And it's important to remember too that good intentions are important, but good intentions aren't always enough. We can be really well intentioned with what we try, but sometimes even when we have the best of intentions, we can still accidentally do something that might still escalate a behavior. And so what we want to do is be really, really strategic and planful about how we're thinking about how we're going to respond to behaviors throughout the cycle, to hopefully come up with a strategic way to prevent those behaviors from escalating. And the reason I'm kind of keep coming back to behaviors, not just in terms of what the child is doing, but also what we as educators are doing too, is that the acting out cycle isn't just about the student's behavior. It's actually a dynamic conversation back and forth between behaviors of other individuals in the environment that oftentimes will perpetuate and escalate, or potentially interrupt and de-escalate the acting out cycle. So it's important to remember that our responses to challenging behavior might actually prompt the next step in the acting out cycle. We might accidentally escalate a behavior, or our response might actually interrupt the behavior by being surprising or calming or relaxing to the individual, and it's going to provide that off ramp. So we really want to think about how our behaviors kind of fit into this chain, and think about how we can participate in behaviors that are going to be de-escalation, or oriented towards de-escalation, because what we want to do is interrupt that behavioral chain, particularly early on, because as we get up the acting out cycle towards the peak, there is more and more momentum that's moving us towards a crisis. And so if we can be really prevention minded and really kind of catch things early in the cycle, we stand a much better chance of interrupting the cycle, because there's just less momentum at that stage. So let's jump into the actual stages of the acting out cycle. As I mentioned, there are seven stages, and we'll go through each one of them. So the first stage is calm. So at the calm phase, basically, this is sort of our classroom during optimal circumstances. Things are going well. Students are academically engaged. They're participating in activities. They're following the rules and expectations. They're responsive to redirections and feedback. Things are going really smoothly. This is excellent, and we want to keep things this way if possible. So what can we do to support that? Some strategies that we can use are just really implementing our CI3T plan with fidelity. This is going to mean reminding students of the expectations on a proactive basis by giving pre-correction, using behavior-specific praise to acknowledge expected behaviors, using other low-intensity strategies like instructional choice to give students a strong sense of self-efficacy, like they're making decisions that are directing their learning, they're doing things that they chose to do and therefore are feeling self-directed. And we're going to think about how we can differentiate instruction, right? Because we want to make sure that we're giving students tasks to do that are at their instructional level, that are using materials and content that's motivating and interesting to them, because all of this is going to basically set up a situation where the student is likely to be successful. For example, we might know that a student struggles in reading. So if they're struggling in reading, how can we match the content that we're providing to them to their instructional abilities and interests? That's a great way to keep that positive momentum going. Some things that we can avoid at the calm phase, and this may seem a little bit surprising. It's like, well, yeah, if things are going well, just keep doing what you're doing. And to a large extent, that's true. However, there is a tendency where when we are aware that there's a student that has kind of explosive behaviors in our classroom, that will minimize our interaction with that student. Particularly when things are going well, where it's like, ooh, I see him working hard over there. I don't want to do anything that's going to disrupt them. And maybe that's smart, but also we want to make sure that we're keeping high expectations for students, providing good feedback, and reinforcing those expected behaviors. Like when students are doing what they're supposed to be doing, if that student is reinforced by positive adult attention, you absolutely want to contribute to the continued success by providing that reinforcement. So we want to avoid kind of this tiptoeing around the student necessarily, because it's not really going to help to fully make them have the full scope of experiences in the classroom that they should have. So that's one thing to kind of keep in mind. Now, that said, as the day goes on, as instruction goes on, there may be things that act as triggers. So a trigger is anything that may cause an escalation in behavior. There can be many different types of triggers, and they're completely dependent on the individual. So here are some examples. We might have triggers that are school-based. These could be things like conflicts with peers or adults, changes in routines, the feeling of being provoked by a peer, being asked to do a task that maybe it's a non-preferred task, feels too difficult, or something that the child just doesn't really like to do. Interacting with problems where the child just lacks the problem-solving skills to find a socially acceptable resolution and not really knowing how to ask for help. A big one is getting feedback. So when an answer is incorrect and we say, oh, great try on that one, but try number 3 again on that math worksheet, feedback can be often a common trigger. So it's good to identify these so that we can be planful for how to respond or how to prevent them from escalating the behavior. Not to say that we're going to avoid anything that might be a trigger, right? We can't avoid giving feedback, but it's important to at least acknowledge and understand that that may be a trigger. Now, not all triggers are actually school-based. So there are things that are going to happen in everyone's life that can cause disruption. And to be clear, we're not always talking about students that have special education or always that are potentially always very explosive in their behavior. Any child on the wrong day or with the wrong thing going on in their life, they might be prone to an escalated behavioral sequence just based on any of these non-school-based triggers. So it's important to keep this in mind because as part of our job of being like empathetic and sensitive individuals interacting with young children often, this is just really important to kind of keep these background things in mind and how they might impact a student. So things like food insecurity, inadequate sleep, potentially difficulties at home, challenges with peers in the neighborhood. Any one of these things could definitely be something that's preoccupying to a student. It might be impacting their behavior at school. So just because we can't identify a trigger, like something that happened right before an escalated behavior sequence occurs, it doesn't mean that we just missed it at school. There might be something else going on. So it's important to kind of keep in mind what that might be. So what should we do around the trigger? What are some strategies that we could do? The first thing is going to be to identify them. Being perceptive and noting what things might set a student off is going to be really helpful because the only thing that we can do anything different is if we acknowledge and understand what that trigger would be. And then thinking about how we can leverage those low intensity supports around potential triggers is really important. So particularly at school or for school-based triggers, pre-correction, for example, is a low intensity support that's involved or that involves predicting when problems are likely to occur, before the problem occurs, reteaching expectations, and then verbally reminding the student of what they could do when something might occur that could be upsetting. So for example, if you're about to give feedback, you could say, hey, remember, part of our expectations are to be responsible, and being responsible means being a really good student. And so when we got to fix a mistake, that's just part of what we do. So just take a look at number 2 there. It looks like we could make a little correction. And if the student is able to take that feedback in the spirit that it's intended, you want to reinforce that behavior as well. So always kind of keeping in mind how we can use those low intensity supports. And then we might also think about potentially collaborating with parents and families around other triggers that could be happening, not at school. So if a child is struggling with sleep or with difficulties at home, having a really strong relationship with parents and families is absolutely vital so that we can be having a conversation around supporting that student in a holistic fashion. And if it's something like inadequate sleep, I mean, the reality is when people are exhausted, they're going to struggle to learn. And so you might come up with some sort of remediation plan to see, like, is taking a nap in the nurse's office an appropriate response to this? Because at some point, if a child's needs aren't met, like their sort of basic needs, food, water, shelter, clothing, sleep, feeling safe, at some point, you're going to get diminishing returns with instruction. So figuring out how we can support at the school meeting those needs is going to be really important as well. So a lot of this is kind of like around empathy, perceiving patterns, and then really figuring out how can we be proactive in minimizing the potential negative impact of those triggers. So I mentioned low intensity supports a few times during both the calm phase and the trigger phase. If you are unfamiliar with low intensity supports, we have actually a module for each of 7 low intensity supports, like pre-correction, like behavior specific praise. So if you're looking to become an expert in the use of those strategies, definitely check out those modules. They're all purple. They're all available on the enhanced tab of the website, and they provide a really in-depth look for how to put those into place. So that's a great resource for you. And then some pitfalls that we want to avoid at the trigger phase are we want to make sure that there's a tendency basically to kind of like anticipate problems and sort of take kind of a deficit mindset. Like the student really struggles to deal with this trigger. What are we going to do? But remember that students also have strengths. And if we can leverage those strengths to help the child deal with, overcome, or respond to a potentially triggering event, that's really important. So like this, I think the classic example here is like Sense of humor is really important for educators and for students. If you know a student has a sense of humor and can laugh at things, finding a way to, for example, lighten the mood before providing some feedback might be important, because it's reminding the student of the relationship you have, understanding they have this strength, and then leveraging that relationship and the positive social momentum of that to provide feedback or something like that could be really helpful to you. So as you're thinking about triggers, don't just think about the trigger and what problems it might cause, but also think about the student's strengths and how you can bring those into whatever you're going to try to do to soften what the trigger's impact might be. And then just making sure that we just consider and plan around potential triggers. So potentially for students that really do have pretty frequent escalated behaviors, maybe just sitting down and making a list of those triggers and potential responses to each of them is going to be a really helpful activity. And actually, spoiler alert, that's a large part of what the individualized de-escalation plan that we'll talk about later is going to consist of. So we'll come back to that idea later. So the next stage is the agitation phase. So potentially when a trigger comes up, we're going to try to soften the blow of whatever is going on that might trigger an escalation in behavior. We're going to try to prevent that from escalating, but we're not always going to be successful. That's to be expected. So what happens next? A trigger might produce the next phase, which is agitation. So agitation might look a few different ways. It might produce an increase in behavior or a decrease in behavior, which is a little bit confusing because they're opposites. But consider that sometimes when people are agitated, they get really busy. They move around, they feel physically agitated, and it causes kind of an excess of behavior. Wringing hands, darting eyes, pacing around. Those are all things that you might look for. But there's also the more subtle side of a decrease in behavior, because sometimes when people are feeling very upset, it causes sort of this internalized state where you kind of are very within yourself, potentially very like a calm before the storm type kind of thing, staring off into the distance, avoiding eye contact, clasping hands, social withdrawal. These are things that you might want to be aware of for students that are explosive, maybe down the line of the acting out cycle, because we can miss the agitation phase because sometimes it can be a little bit subtle with that decrease in behavior. So definitely something to consider. And when this is occurring, what we want to do as far as strategies, I think I skipped a slide, is to focus on reducing anxiety. So basically, a really great strategy for reducing anxiety is to take an instructional approach to behavior, which is kind of the opposite of taking a traditional disciplinarian approach to acting out behavior. So if you have a child who's getting up out of their seat and pacing around the room, the natural instinct is to maybe it's a harsh rebuke, or maybe it's even a gentle rebuke, but a rebuke might actually be sort of the exact opposite of what you'd want to do here. So instead, what we really want to do is we want to show empathy to a student who might be agitated, because that first thing, that our first response by showing empathy, hey, it looks like you're feeling upset, what's going on, feels very, very different from you need to go back to your seat right now. It acknowledges that they're a human being with something that's going on, something that's causing them to feel upset. And it engages in much more of a problem-solving dialogue than a you need to follow my direction right now kind of dialogue. So the 6-step instructional approach, I'm not going to go way into detail. We actually have a whole module on learning this six-step instructional approach, which is a really, really good module for getting a good just routine of like when problem behavior occurs, whether it be minor or major. What should I do? In brief, you want to show empathy. You want to keep instruction moving forward. So not sucking all of your attention into the challenging behavior, but just briefly acknowledging it, showing empathy, making sure everybody else has what they need by acknowledging other students who are meeting expectations, and then providing really brief redirections of expected behavior, again, in an empathetic fashion, and then providing time and space for the student to hear what has been said. It's basically the opposite of rebuke and nag, which, not to be like, it sounds very sort of negative, but like it's natural. It comes natural to us to say, you need to follow my directions. And then they don't follow directions. Like, you need to follow my directions. At some point, it sort of becomes this circular nagging thing that, although it makes sense to us, like you repeat something that's not been followed, it may not feel very constructive to the person that we're talking to. And frankly, if they've already heard us, they already know what we want them to do. And if they're not doing it, we need to kind of figure out how we can get on their level and help them to be successful rather than just sort of keep piling it on. And then if this works, then we can reinforce, the students eventually kind of getting back and following the behavioral expectations. And if it doesn't work and we're escalating, then we can kind of think about what to do next. So this 6-step instructional approach is really helpful for reducing anxiety because it takes, I want to say, sort of a gentle approach, an instructional approach that is clear, calm. It's not ignoring problem behavior. We're meeting it head on, but we're doing so in a fashion that is empathetic and clear rather than that sort of potentially I'm getting frustrated with you kind of thing that sometimes it happens to all of us. It's not, it's not something we need to feel badly about as educators. It's part of life. We're trying to do our lesson. We're trying to help our kids learn academically, but we need to kind of keep in mind, how can we take that instructional approach when challenging behavior occurs? So that's going to be our main strategy at the agitation phase. A pitfall here is that we should remember that this is really actually an opportunity, not an inconvenience. So it can be frustrating when these problems happen. It's interrupting instruction. It's interrupting learning. However, we want students to be self-reflective. We want students to be individuals that can think about their actions and make responsible choices. And this is the opportunity for them to practice self-regulation, self-soothing, responsibility, self-regulation. So we need to think about how we can support students in being successful at those skills, rather than kind of thinking of this as a nuisance. And it's really important too, when frustrating things happen and then the child actually does they follow expectations after you remind them gently once or twice. We really want to reinforce that. We're not reinforcing that they got off track. We're reinforcing that they were able to get back on track. So definitely want to make sure that we're not forgetting to kind of do that positive last step of acknowledging those behaviors. So I think you've probably heard enough of me talking. So we're going to take a break from listening for just a second. We're going to watch a quick video that provides a pretty cool illustration of maybe a non-example, maybe kind of what not to do in the agitation phase. And then we're going to watch an example of what you could do that would be a little bit better. To do this, I'm going to stop sharing my video for just 1 second and reshare. So give me just a moment.
And while Mark's pulling that up, we want to let you know that under that accordion for tonight, there's a Word document that has the links and the QR codes to access these videos. We often get requests for those. So just know that you have access to these and a few others.
Yeah, Kathleen, thanks for reminding me. I want to show everybody where you can download that in just a little bit. Unfortunately, this video is not one that's available, but there are tons of videos that are kind of like this that show good examples and bad examples of how to respond that are available, that are all linked on this one resource guide. So definitely, if I forget to do that, someone remind me and we'll pull that up on the website. Okay, let's go ahead and watch our first video. And if you can't hear this, just holler at me and we'll fix the sound. Okay, so we kind of saw a what not to do example. If you are not driving a car, would you open up your chat and maybe just type one thing that you saw that happened there that either showed the student was agitated or something the teacher did that might have made that situation not ideal. In the chat that she kind of leaned over and touched the student's shoulder. That's a good point. Let's talk about that in a second. Yeah, rebuke and nag.
Just way too close, when a kid's already distressed like that.
Yeah, no expression of empathy in private space, standing over him, for sure. For what it's worth, if you look at the teacher's body language, in no way does she seem aggressive towards him, or she's kind of annoyed a little bit, but she comes over and puts her hand on his shoulder, which I think is meant as a gesture of support and empathy. So I think that's a good illustration that good intentions aren't always quite enough, because we can do something with good intentions and still produce a bad result. It's the wrong time. That's the wrong time for that. And she puts herself in a position where, if that student really lashed out and pushed her or was physically aggressive, of course, that's never acceptable behavior. But by kind of entering his zone in that agitated phase, we're providing an opportunity for that aggression to occur. And we want to be really mindful that we're protecting ourselves and protecting the student to not put them in a position where it's easy for them to lash out in that fashion. So, okay, great ideas in the chat. I'm going to share my screen again in just a minute. We're going to watch a slightly better example of what she could have done. if you are in a place where you can safely type into the chat, put something that she did better or really well this time, giving time to process. Yeah, she showed empathy pretty much immediately, right? That was her first response. Got down on his level. So I like this video because it does a good job showing how behavior chains happen. In the first video, because of her initial responses to kind of be like, it's time for math, get started. And he's like, I don't care. And even though that's not like that big of a deal, like in the grand scheme of things, it's a pretty minor, it's not even a behavioral incident. He's just kind of being negative. In the other video, she immediately sort of notices proactively that he's struggling and leads with that. And so it doesn't even let the very first link in the chain towards the acting out behavior take place, because she's like, hey, you doing okay? And like, he doesn't answer her, but he doesn't have to, because he's already saying, I'm not okay. And then she gives him time and space, which you can see how that whole interaction changes from the very first step. And then I know a couple of people mentioned the timing, like she gave him time, right? What I like about the video is that she walks away from him. She walks to the back of the room, checks on students in the back, and then she starts walking towards the front. And you think she's going to go and talk to him, but she actually walks right by him, checks on the kids in the front of the room, and then circles back, which is subtle, but basically she's communicating. Like if he's watching out of the corner of his eye, that although she cares that he's not started and she's asked him if he's doing okay, so she cares about him, he also knows this isn't the only thing that she's doing and that he's not going to monopolize the entire classroom with what's happening. So it kind of gives him an opportunity to maybe like, all right, I'm not getting, all the attention here. I'm just going to get started. That didn't happen, but potentially it could have. And then when she does get back to him, it's time to get started. She's not asking a question. She's like, it's time to get started. And with her body language, they basically got started together, which is building that positive momentum towards the task. I think in middle school classrooms, particularly, like that's where this is taking place. It's a beautiful illustration, but like even in early elementary grades, you can see how this would play out in a similar way. So kind of a helpful little illustration there.
And as you're pulling up your screen again, I want to say another thing that I love about this video is that way that some of you mentioned that like she got down at his level behind him, but I loved how private the whole thing was, where she did the first one and then just didn't ask him again, just handed him the pencil. And I thought it was such a nice gesture, because then it's not anything that anybody else can hear if they're doing their own work. So I love that. Good analysis, Mark.
Cool. So if we've been successful at this point, we may have provided that off-ramp to the student already, and we don't need to worry about the next phase. But that's not always going to be the case. Sometimes agitation will lead to acceleration. So what does that look like? Oftentimes, this is where behavior starts to get big. So even if the student started with a decrease in behavior, which I think in the last example, you could characterize that as sort of a decrease. His head is down, he's not doing very much. Suddenly, based on the continuation of the cycle, that behavior is going to get much more noticeable and kind of loud, maybe literally loud. Could look like argumentation, noncompliance, provoking behavior, threatening, potentially even beginning with some like minor property destruction. So these are things that we're really starting to have real concerns about. And these are things that are going to need to be responded to in some fashion. So what should we do here? An important first step is going to be, to whatever extent it's reasonable and makes sense, we should try to eliminate triggers. I think the classic example of this is if the situation is a peer who feels provoked by another peer. The best thing we can do at this stage is, even if the other peer who allegedly provoked the student who's kind of engaging in or experiencing the acting out cycle, they didn't really do anything, we still can interrupt this by saying, hey, you know what, why don't you move over there? Let's give, Tony some space. Move that student away. And we're doing everybody involved a favor, because we're, if physical aggression is something we need to be concerned about at the peak stage, we're getting that student out of harm's way and really just kind of giving the student who's having the difficulty an opportunity to calm down, with that stimulus, that trigger removed from kind of their immediate area. We also want to just be as non-threatening as possible. So even as the student is getting louder and their behavior is getting more noticeable, we want our behavior to become more subtle and be very non-threatening. We can do this by maintaining a threatening body position, hands clasped in front of us. We can stay, relatively small instead of being big. So don't tower over the student, but rather kind of get down on their level, but always giving space. Potentially, we might just provide a reminder of what the expected behavior is and then give that student space. If the behaviors that are occurring in the acceleration phase aren't super concerning, like things that are really requiring your immediate response, just give them that reminder and give them time to decompress and walk away. And regardless of what's going to happen, we're going to maintain a calm, respectful, and somewhat detached attitude. We want to avoid, I'll get to it in pitfalls. We want to avoid being like overly sympathetic at this stage, because like jumping right in and being like super over the top empathetic might actually be adding more attention and more fuel to the fire, or we might be reinforcing some of those behaviors that we don't really want to see. And so it's important not to give too much attention, but just sort of this detached, but respectful and empathetic response. And then the last piece is using non-confrontational limit setting procedures. Limit setting is sort of its whole own topic, and I won't go way deep into it. If you're interested in this, the module actually contains really nice links to resources that are available on some external sites, like the Crisis Prevention Institute has some good handouts about what limit setting looks like. Basically, limit setting is when you've got kids that are ramping up. This is sort of their last chance to make a responsible decision with consideration to what might happen as a consequence of my actions. So if you've got students that engage in property destruction, like, tearing up rooms or making a mess or something like that, this is the time to remind them. And I want to be careful in the way I phrase this, to remind them that if they make a choice, that they're going to have to kind of live with the consequences of that choice. So for example, if they make a mess, they're probably going to have to clean that mess up. That's sort of a natural consequence of their behavior. What we want to do is we want to be careful to not make this sound like an ultimatum or a threat. So to be clear, we're not saying if you tear the room up, you're going to have to clean it up, or you're going to have to miss recess to clean it up. We want to find a way to explain this to a student, to be like, remember that sometimes when you get upset and you start to tear up your papers and stuff like that, it makes a mess, and we have to clean that up later. You want to present it in a fashion where they can hear you and understand that it's not you telling them that they're going to be punished if they act out, but rather that when they act out, they need to think about their behaviors to avoid doing things that they don't want to have to deal with the consequences of. So we want to avoid a power struggle. We want to remind them that there are limits to their behavior, and help them find those limits, and remind them that, the consequences that do exist are ones that can be positive or negative, and help them really make a good choice to get an outcome that they can live with. So this is an opportunity maybe to give some choices potentially to, choose to go and take a break, or to get some air, or, move away from that trigger instead of engaging with it. So some things we want to avoid are being anything but neutral. We really don't want to be overly cheery or, of course, sarcastic or frustrated at this stage, because that's only going to propel the situation towards the peak behavior. And so we really do want to remain as neutral as possible. So with that in mind, we're going to show one more video. I'm going to share my screen here.
This will be another one of the non-examples and then the examples. So think of this like what not to wear for behavior. Thank you for smiling, Leanne.
Caleb, cool it. Okay, everyone, I need you to get your papers out from yesterday. Those need to be on your desk. Caleb, if you do not have yours out, that will be a 0 for this assignment. Caleb, I am not going to play these games with you today. Pick up the paper or go to the office. Pick it up. Caleb, I don't know what your problem is, but you will not be disruptive in my class. Do you understand what I'm saying?
What y'all looking at?
That's it. To the office. Out.
Okay. So not really very ideal. Yeah. And feel free to put your comments in the thread about, maybe some less than ideal responses there. But what's interesting to me about this one is that the teacher is inheriting a student that's already agitated. And it's a good reminder that sometimes we're not going to see the beginning of the acting out cycle, because even in elementary school, we know kids are coming from recess, they're coming from specials, they're coming from the lunchroom, and who knows what happened there. And so it's really sort of our responsibility to be vigilant and mindful that if we notice that a student is already in the agitated phase, we need to be thinking that, oh, we're already here. So how do I need to respond to this? And so yeah, repeated badgering. And really too, like she asked him to pick up the paper. Like he already was really escalating. And what if he went and picked up the paper? Like there was an out there. Like he gave her an out to be like, okay, just go on with instruction and then go over and be like, I can see you're upset. I appreciate you picking up the paper and making a good choice. Like what's going on? Like there was an opportunity there, but she actually escalated it further by continuing to kind of be like, I'm not going to take that. And that kind of led to him storming out of the room. So now let's look at a potentially better resolution in the next video.
Okay, everybody, I need you to get out your papers that we were working on yesterday and start on problem number 7. Problem number 7. Caleb, look, you almost were finished with this yesterday. I want you to start here on number 7. You know how to do these problems. It's just like number 6 from yesterday. So can you go ahead and get started? I need you to make a good choice.
Man, I'm not in the mood today.
I can see that you're not in the mood, Caleb, but I really need you to get this assignment finished, okay? Make a good choice. You need to pass this class.
Man, Mr. Carson giving me detention for nothing?
I can see that you're upset and with Mr. Carson, and you and I can talk about that detention later, okay? But right now it's important to focus on math and get this problem done. Keisha, nice job. Great choice, Caleb. Nice job.
So pretty dramatic difference in that one, right? Use the chat to throw in there something that you think she did a particularly good job with doing. Yeah, reminded him he's capable of doing it. That was a pretty good example of limit setting where he was clearly frustrated about something that happened during the last class, and he said he wanted to talk about it. And she basically didn't say, no, we're not going to talk about it, but she said, we're not going to talk about it right now. So she's setting limits to be like, that's a fair thing for us to discuss, but we need to find the right time to talk about it. That's a really good example. And then, yeah, she reinforced Caleb's behavior when he got back on task. That's right. Okay, so let's continue on to the last stage of the acting out cycle. The last escalated part of the acting out cycle, the peak behavior. The car is on fire. Things are not going well. So at the peak stage, overall behavior is out of control. This is sort of the type of event that when you know it when you see it. Oftentimes you'll see elopement, physical aggression, property destruction. Oftentimes you can kind of classify these whole things as like a severe tantrum. So what are we going to do at the peak phase? What we need to do is primarily remember that we want to focus on safety. As much as we'd like to use proactive strategies and be preventative, we really want to orient all of that towards making sure that the student is safe, that we are safe, that peers are safe. So whatever you have in terms of a safety plan, you want to use at this stage to make sure that you have the resources at your disposal to keep everyone out of harm's way. So the actual safety plan itself, we won't go into detail on right now because that's largely a school by school decision. If that's something you need, you might have a conversation with your administrator and CI3T leadership team to figure out what is a safety plan and what's our plan. But yeah, that's sort of a plan that you'll want to make as a school. However, some things we want to avoid potentially. This is important, but you do kind of have to balance out, keeping people safe with what's reasonable. But we would like to avoid reinforcing a lot of these peak behaviors if possible. So not providing more attention than what is needed to keep the student safe is going to be potentially important if students are reinforced by attention, for example. So that's going to be really important. And we don't spend a whole lot of time on the peak because that really is all there is to it. At this stage, we're waiting it out. We're keeping people safe, and we're giving hopefully time and space for that to take place. But what's really important is what happens next, which is the de-escalation phase. And I think this is where a lot of mistakes often happen that can cause an escalated instance of behavior to go on way, way longer. So what this looks like is potential signs of disorientation, denial, and arguing, potentially even trying to make initial amends or avoiding interacting with others. So this can look very different based on the individual. I'll get to it when we talk about pitfalls, but there is a danger that what we do at this phase could actually send the student back up the cycle to peak. So we want to be really careful at this stage to make sure that we're focusing on de-escalation and don't accidentally escalate to the student's behavior. So we're going to continue focusing on safety by monitoring the student's behavior and helping to get them moving in the right direction. So building behavioral momentum in a productive direction. Potentially this looks like giving people time and space to cool down, giving them something they can do on their own. Doesn't matter if it's academic or not. If they like doing math problems as like a calm down, cool. If they like doing something that's just not too entertaining, but a little bit soothing, great. But we're just going to continue monitoring and making sure that everyone is doing something that's safe without adding a whole lot of attention or demands onto the student at this time. What we really want to do is avoid initiating a lot of conversations about what just happened, because oftentimes this can have the exact opposite effect. We do need to have that conversation eventually, but now is not the time. We want to make sure that they are fully de-escalated and in a position where they're ready to engage in a productive conversation. And so that's the biggest mistake, is trying to do the de-escalation activity before the student is really ready. So we can even think about the body, right? Like our heartbeat is elevated, breathing is fast, our pulse is quickened. We want to wait until they're sort of all the way back at a baseline calm level before we really get to the last phase, which is recovery. So let's talk about what recovery looks like. This is going to be shifting, hopefully, our attention to quickly acknowledging what went wrong and moving on with the day to get back to productive work at school. This is going to look like, from the student perspective, eagerness to move on with their day, looking forward to the next thing in the schedule potentially. So saying, when is lunch, or, when do we go to PE, or when do we go to recess? Suggests maybe they're ready to kind of move on with their day. Potentially, they're still going to be reluctant to interact and discuss the situation that occurred, or even be defensive about what happened. That's to be expected, but there's one, being defensive is one thing, and being like agitated is another. So definitely, as you're kind of trying to decide whether you're really at the recovery phase, you're looking to see, like, can they have a civil conversation with me about what's going on? So at this stage, our strategy is about debriefing with a student and helping them to transition back to normal activities. We'll talk about debriefing sessions in a minute, but it's a good idea if you have students that do engage in really escalated peak behaviors from time to time, that if you have a debriefing strategy or routine, to have practiced it beforehand when the student actually isn't upset or isn't trying to get down off of this dramatic thing that's happened in their day, so that they have some experience going through the process. And we're going to be focusing on positive aspects too. So reinforcing students for having the conversation or for being perceptive about what happened. We're not blaming them. We're having this debriefing session with a very productive mindset. So the goal is not to hammer on the child, and really reiterate what they did wrong and all the things that they did that were bad choices and what they won't do again. We really want to focus on just identifying what a more appropriate behavioral response would have been, focusing on problem solving, potentially trying to get their insight to understand what went wrong. And the better relationship you have with the student, the more productive this conversation is going to be, because they need to trust that you're not asking these questions to extract an emotional toll on them or to make them revisit, what they did wrong. You really want to know, you have to legitimately want to know, and the student needs to know that you want to know so that you can help them the next time that might come up. So this is where we're really capitalizing on those professional and good solid relationships with students to help kind of work through this and figure out what was going on, and legitimately figure out, what could we have done differently? What could you have done differently? What could I have done differently? Looking across the board at sort of different things that we could do to prevent that from happening again. So a pitfall here is that we want to make sure that we do follow through on consequences without sort of getting back into this like cycle of punishment or being overly critical of the student's behavior. We want to move on. So we need to follow through with the consequence, like filling out an office discipline referral or notifying parents without making it seem like, we're kind of going back all through that crisis cycle again. So as we're thinking about those steps of the acting out cycle, what we want to do is have a plan for how we can use our understanding of student behavior during the acting out cycle to make a plan to respond. So in the module that we've talked about before, we actually have a comprehensive guide for how to put together an individualized de-escalation plan that's going to be a collaborative approach to coming up with a really clear step-by-step guidance for what anyone that works with this child at school is supposed to look out for across the cycle and what they can do at each stage of the acting out cycle. This intervention or this module has a comprehensive guide for how to put together these plans, including a step-by-step process that's basically going to walk you all the way through each of 8 steps that go from, using data to connect students to supports, to putting together a team that's going to include teachers, interventionists, the students' family members, the student themselves, having a team meeting to go through and identify the specific behaviors that happen at each stage of the acting out cycle, and coming up with strategies that we can use at each stage to respond and prevent the escalation of behavior. Throughout this process, we're going to get information back from the student, their family, and teachers to figure out, hey, is this plan that we put together likely to do what it's intended to do? We're going to figure out how we can collect data to figure out, are we implementing this as planned? And we're going to go through a process to train everybody who works with that child to know exactly what the plan says. This is an often skipped step where maybe we train the main teacher of the child, but kind of forget to talk about like, hey, the music teacher needs to know this too, right? They have difficulty at recess. The recess supervisors need to know this as well. So making sure that everyone involved has the opportunity to learn the plan and know exactly what to do. We're also going to teach any additional strategies that the student might need to know to be successful in working through the plan, and then continuing to collect data throughout the course of implementation. You'll notice I did not go into great detail about each of those steps, but rest assured that if this is an intervention that you're looking for resources to implement at your school, each of these is detailed in microscopic detail. There's all the forms and guidance that you need to actually get this off the ground at your school in this module. So we definitely encourage you to check that out if you're interested in implementing individualized de-escalation plans. So we do want to take us to a breakout room now. We'll have about, I think, 5 or 6 minutes to talk about this module, and then we'll come back and talk about internalizing behaviors at Tier 3.
And we're going to spend a little bit of time now switching gears to think about students with internalizing issues. So we're thinking about kids that have intensive intervention need that are on the other side. And I want to mention again, it's not that it's all completely mutually exclusive, but one of the things that we're excited to share with you in this resource is that we've had the opportunity to build this resource with some leading school psychologists in the research community as well as practitioners. So I want to give a shout out to Emily Iovino, who is not with us tonight, but she was a big lead in contributing to these resources, as were Amy Brees and Sandy Shafoulias. And I think this has been another gift from the Institute of Education Sciences that we've had, we have PIs across 6 different regions. So one of the things that I just want to highlight to you, and this is just going to be a short little bit of time to listen, and then we're going to give you some time to explore these, is that one of the things we wanted to create here are some resources, because this is often the least understood for teachers, because it's not surprising, but kids that have those real pronounced acting out issues, those are the first things that are capturing our attention. So we want to make sure that we have the opportunity to put resources in the hands of teachers, and we're not asking them to be school psychologists. We're not asking them to be behavior interventionists. We're not asking them to be counselors, but we want people to be able to understand a little bit more about what that means to have an internalizing issue. And so it can show up, and there's variety. Like a lot of the focus that we've been working on and with some of our partners is helping kids to understand like what their anxious feelings, what that feels like, what their body feels like, and getting strategies to manage that. And then having a way of keeping track of not just how I'm feeling, but how I feel when I'm using those strategies. So you might think about anxiety as some of these characteristics when you heard kids have those persistent negative patterns of their thinking and the way they're speaking about things. They could be avoiding work, seem breathless. And I think a lot of us have been in that situation where you feel almost breathless from being so anxious. And for some kids, it's just like, it's a little bit of a trembling feeling. And you'll also see that for some kids that co-occurs with depression, like things that used to really bring them joy is not bringing them joy anymore. And that idea of feeling just really sad and having trouble concentrating in school and general irritability. And not surprisingly, that's also then tends to show up in terms of social withdrawal. So they're not typically engaging with their peers. And being alone is not necessarily a bad thing, but when kids spend a lot of a time alone, that can also be indicative of some challenges. So we want to make sure that they have the degree of comfort to be with friends and with peers and enjoy life. And for many people, as kids and adults, it shows up as somatization, where they have legitimate physical pain, but it is related to their internalizing issues. And it is real. It is real headaches. It is real stomach aches. So we want to make sure that teachers know that. And it's truly not a faking it kind of a thing, but these behaviors co-occur together. And when I think about internalizing issues, another thing that I celebrate from each of you on this call is that you're in districts that are looking for kids at the first sign of concern. You're looking for kids that have both major challenges of childhood, the externalizing that we just talked about, as well as internalizing issues. So one of the things that we'd like to highlight in this resource, and if you look at the cover of this one, it's on that same tier 3 row that Mark was showing you, and it's the one with this little boy on the front of it, is there's a bunch of other resources where you can get measures and tools to think about, what do I need to know if I need to know more? Because your screener is just a screener. It is not a diagnostic. So like when you have tried things that are like higher rates of behavior specific praise, or you've maybe done a self-monitoring intervention, their check in, check out has even been very effective for kids with internalizing issues. But when those are not enough or not effective enough, and we're starting to get into tier 3, with parent permission, it's a wonderful idea to get permission to get additional information so you know how to focus some of those intervention efforts. So you can see a little bit more in those resources about how you can find specifics of information with parent permission. And sometimes they're completed by the teacher, sometimes they're completed by the parent, sometimes if the child is 8 years and older, it's completed by the child. But we can ground out that information so that we know how to intervene, particularly if tier 2 supports have not been enough for those students. And so some of the things that we're going to dip a toe into right now is we want to open up these resources into this tier 3 module. But what we want to share with you is this rich resource that kind of explains a little bit about starting at tier 1 and then moving into tier 2, but a strong emphasis on showing you how to do some intensification. So some of the things that might be listed in your manuals now, or might be things that you're going to explore for another time, is basically building on your base. So when you think about the things that you do right now at tier 1 that supports kids' well-being and specifically addresses internalizing issues, you are teaching some skill sets right now at tier 1 to teach kids to become more self-aware, to be able to regulate their feelings, to be able to manage their own behaviors. You are teaching kids things like empathy and being able to ask for what you need, and that's great. And for some kids, even when that's done extremely well, it is not going to be enough. So you might have, as a tier 2 support, something like counselor-led lessons. And so at your school, like if you're using Second Step, or if you're using Harmony, or if you're using Positive Action, one wonderful thing about what you're doing is you have information on what's been taught and what's being used at tier 1. And then if you have counselor-led lessons, you can go deeper. Now, some, like Positive Action, actually come with a counselor kit, and they're separate lessons and they build upon them. So you might think about a tier 2 support being something like where, yes, you're going to pull kids together 2 to 3 days a week for 30-minute sessions, and you're going to use the same language systems, the same vocabulary, but intensify what they need. And the cool thing about these is that there are tools out there like Skills for Success or Social Skills Improvement System rating scales, where you can find out what are this child's strengths? What are the performance deficits? And importantly, what is not yet in their repertoire? What have they not yet learned to do? And that can become the base of what's done in this small group. And you don't have to group all kids with the exact same challenges in the same group. So we're going to celebrate all the diversity in those groups, but we want to have kids that do have some acquisition deficits. And you bring them together, and as part of that, you're telling them, you're showing them, you're doing it. And for some kids, that still may not be enough. So you might intensify that as a tier 3 support at tier 3, where they do that same plan of 2 to 3 days a week. And then you might add a once a week, 30-minute one-on-one, so that you can prompt them on, okay, let's talk about what we learned this week or what we learned last week, and ask them, how have you used it? How has it gone? Give them a little bit more positive practice. These are just some of the ideas about how you can intensify, build on the base at tier 1, have those small groups, scaffold them with tier 3 in greater intensification. And also a part of that might be too, that whoever's leading that group, like if Wendy's the teacher that has us, she can go back and say, this is really what we've been working on. Can you be on the lookout for them using these behaviors, and really use that school-wide system to acknowledge their use of that? Because when we are teaching skills in those small groups and doing focused instruction for them, we want to create those opportunities for them to try it out at tier 1 and have it be recognized. And some schools decouple it. So, and I think, to be really honest with you, this is why a lot of those really focused small group interventions like social skills or anger management, conflict resolution, and even addressing feelings of anxious behavior, is that those are not taught in a way that align with what's happening at tier 1. So the kid comes out of this group, they're trying something that nobody knows what's going on. They're not yet fluent in it. So it kind of, it stalls. It doesn't go very well. Another really wonderful thing to learn more about is CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. And we are not suggesting that teachers become the psychologist, but we want you to be aware of CBT, because this is emphasizing this whole relationship between thoughts and feelings and behaviors. This is an infographic that is provided in those resources that explains that, what I think is going to affect what I feel and what I do. How I feel is actually going to reflect what's going on in my head, and it's going to influence the behaviors that I do. So, and then ultimately the behavior that I engage in, it also impacts how I'm feeling. And if we can help kids to understand that, we can help give them new ways of thinking. So in some kids, it can be that, like, I'm just super anxious about going to this reading group because if my teacher asks me a question in front of this group and I don't know the answer to it, I might get the wrong thing. They might laugh at me. If they laugh at me, I'm going to feel embarrassed. If I feel embarrassed, I'm not going to want to play with them during recess. And if I'm not playing with them during recess, then I might as well not even go to school. And if I don't go to school, then I'm not going to graduate. If I don't graduate, I'm not going to get a job. If I don't get a job, I'm going to be homeless. And then if I'm homeless, I'm not going to have a place to eat. I don't know where I'm going to shower. I'm going to have to find a fountain. Then all of a sudden, this kid is showering in a fountain in their mind, but it's just a reading group. And it's the fear of getting a thing wrong. So we can interrupt all those persistent negative thoughts. And part of the thing that you can access in this resource is go through these different techniques that are involved in cognitive behavior therapy. And again, we're not asking teachers to do these, but be aware that these are possibilities. And at the district level or the school level, this might be the time to think about what can we incorporate at tier 2 and tier 3, and who would be the best professionals to make that happen. So for example, it might be that you choose as one of your learning opportunities to share out some of this resources to help people understand how you can even use like psychoeducational techniques. So this might be like a counselor set of lessons or school psychologist running a small group, or it might be at later stages involving community aging partnerships. But we want people to understand, the kids need to know that they're absolutely not alone in this, and that other people have some of those same interfering thoughts. And so on this infographic, as you're looking at this, it shares you a little bit of information, and then it also connects with families. So in other words, at home, it can help, like parents can help to normalize those feelings. Like if a kid is feeling anxious about a spelling test, or feeling nervous about not doing well at the soccer game, or feeling nervous about having a substitute coming up because their teacher's going on maternity leave, the parent can say things, yeah, sometimes I feel anxious or restless like that too. And it's school, we just want every educator to have some ideas about the similarities and being able to identify what it looks like in a student's behavior patterns and then know what to do with it. That idea of cognitive restructuring, teaching them new ways to talk about themselves, I think that's also helpful. And you can help people to identify thought patterns that maybe, frankly, aren't super realistic. It is very unlikely that if a kid gets something wrong in that small group, that somebody is going to respond in such an unkind way without the teacher intervening. And it is very unlikely that they're not going to have somebody to hang out with forever again on the playground, and that they'll become unemployed and not have a place to shower. So we can really help people together to manage those worrisome feelings. And sometimes, and especially right now in the COVID era, we put this example together about, like, and some kids did have this, they felt very anxious or worried that, a parent or a loved one's going to get sick at home. And that sometimes kids were afraid to go back and leave their families for a period of time. And so we want to help them to, set, more manageable thought patterns that my dad was fine when I left this morning. And I know he's going to take good care of himself. He's going to mask up. He's going to be okay. And he'll probably be okay when safe at work and be fine when he gets home. Other things that I think could be really wonderful that could be embedded at tier 1 and as well as at tier 2 and tier 3 that teachers could do is using relaxation techniques. And I would be remiss without mentioning Kimber Vanis's amazing work on interventions that she put together in her partnerships with Cecil Reynolds and Randy Campus. But we can teach kids relaxation strategies. We can teach them breathing strategies. And some of you might have used this where you're teaching kids how to do things like belly breathing or box breathing or nasal breathing. We can even teach kids how to walk through guided imagery and even doing things like progressive muscle relaxation. Those are strategies that we can teach kids so that if they learn what their body's feeling like when they're anxious, they can employ those strategies. And again, those home connections, like these would be cards if I was going to do these types of things that I'd want to share home with families. In addition to that, we can, and this is very, very practical that can be done at a school, is activity scheduling. So actually helping to have time with kids and families to collaborate. And I want to really be clear, we're not suggesting that people come together at tier 2 or tier 3 to say to a family, this is what we're going to do. The idea is this is a collaborative process. If you're screening data or suggesting that this child has tier 3 needs for internalizing issues, you might get permission from the family to garner other information. You can show your intervention grids what you have as opportunities to look like, and this might be one of them. So some things, for example, especially when a kid is struggling to find joy in their life, it could be an opportunity for them to actually have time to do some scheduling, like what brings you joy. So like, I love spending time with you all in these trainings. For me, these are a bright spot, getting to see you. The other thing that I do for myself so that I can feel good is 5 days a week, I get up and I go to the gym in the morning. It's 1 hour. I am by far the least fit and least athletic person in there. And I am bringing back the geriatric crew to the CrossFit community. But for me, it feels good. I enjoy the physical exercise. I see people that I wouldn't get otherwise to see. It might be social things. It might be hobbies. It might be, learning how to plant. But we want to help kids find those things. In addition, there's things like this, like systematic desensitization, where you create that from something that doesn't frighten you at all to something that creates you a lot of stress, and you build this chain and you go very slowly. And I would like to exercise extreme caution when you're looking at this, that this you would want to do with a trained professional, like the kid that has terrible fears of leaving a parent or terrible fears of failure at school. You would want to make sure that you progress very slowly as this strategy. But we wanted to show you all these pieces that are available. And one of the nice things that you can also do, and some of you have heard about direct behavior ratings, and we have a whole other module on that. You can use these together, like direct behavior ratings, to help kids monitor their feelings, their engagement. And in this module, there's a whole individualized cognitive behavior therapy plan that you could collaborate on with families, with a trained professional learning, using this as a strategy. So again, it might be the school psychologist, the counselor, somebody that's comfortable with it. And just like Mark mentioned, it's also going to be important to make sure that you have the resources to engage in this comfortably. So you'll see some information to find out like what people think about the goals, the procedures, the outcomes, like social validity before they start, and then having plans for making sure that it is in place. So when you look at these forms, you'll see that there's social validity forms that the teacher and the family can complete, as well as the student, and then plans for keeping it all intact. And one thing that I want to mention is that Tier 3 can also involve connections to community partners. And we do not want that to be a mystery for people. So if you have the opportunity to engage with community partners, you want to operationalize that into Tier 3 grid so that families and educators in your building don't see that as some mystery of something that's happening over here, but it actually can be embedded as part of the practice. So like, can you connect to resources within your community? Can you connect to community mental health agencies? Sometimes universities, such as ours, offers supports. And of course, there's emergency responses. How many of you have heard of wraparound services? Will you raise your hand if you've heard of those? Perfect. That's an excellent Tier 3 support that can be dedicated specifically. Grant Allen, way to raise your hand. So long that the computer caught it. So we can have those same types of things. So you want to think about that entry criteria, making it clear that it's going to be for people that really have intensive intervention needs. So they're scoring in the high risk range. And then they may have had limited success with these other strategies. And we want to use those data, both from those diagnostics as well as responsiveness to Tier 2 to make some decisions. So if this is already on your radar, you might be thinking, oh, we don't actually have that listed in our grid yet. And as Mark mentioned earlier, we're not going to make changes into our plans this year, but we might add this as a support for students with internalizing needs later. And one of the other things that's available to you, if you go that direction, is we want to make sure that the community partner is at the table with you. They need to know about your CI3T plan so that they know what's happening at Tier 1, so they can build on that base knowledge for the students, because part of that is programming for generalization. So you're going deeper on those pieces so that kids can be successful. And we even have connections for you, like an exemplar of what you might use. So you have a blank one you can make for yourself, as well as some community connections. So as we wrap up today, I'm hoping that you will think a little bit about the successes that you do have in place at your school. And I agree with what I posted in the chat. There's so many more kids right now that are struggling with internalizing issues. This is the place to look at your school-wide data. Look at the triangles. What percentage of kids are in the low, moderate, and high risk level? And if you've got more than 20% of your kids struggling in the area of internalizing, then we want to be pulling from those validated resources, some of which are here, some of which are in your curriculum that you're using as part of that social and emotional well-being domain. But we want to connect those resources to the kids that do need them. And some of them will be at Tier 3. The other thing we wanted to show you is that another evidence-based practice is functional assessment-based interventions. And yes, these are intensive. And if kids need those, we want to make sure that we use those, because we know that this helps to identify not just what the challenge is, but the replacement behavior, like the thing you want to teach kids to do, like more positive thought patterns that can help them to be more engaged, enjoy more life more fully, or maybe interact with their peers more fully. That on this tab, there's a whole tab that's dedicated to functional assessment-based interventions. And in it is everything you would need to go download this and do it as a Tier 3 support. There's even illustrations of what the grids could look like if you put them in place. And John Umbright from University of Arizona, he designed this whole approach in 2007-ish. And I want to let you know, he and Jolena Farrow and Carl Liopson are actually finishing, it's already at a publisher, a new book that is updating the field on how to do this in CI3T system. So the whole thing is situated as a Tier 3 support. I will keep you posted as to when that comes out, but it will their book will connect to everything that's updated on the website so that you'll have the resources. You're very sweet, Wendy. So just know that we've got these resources here for you now. And I loved a comment that Eric made in the breakout room that I got to share with him about, those low intensity supports that we talk about all the time. You're hearing those and how they're using the acting out cycle. And you're knowing that for kids, like with internalizing issues, once they start to learn those strategies, we want to pre-correct them to remind them, if I'm heading into a stressful situation or this might feel uncomfortable, what's one thing that you learned in this group or with this person that you might try out today? So that is why our general education community needs to know what those approaches are so that they can not be afraid of those conversations, but welcome them. So as we close out today, we are again so thankful for your time, and we'll be back together with you on April 26th if you'd like to join us. And on April 26th, our hope is that you'll come with your plan, and we're going to actually build out a little action plan for you with what we can do together between now and the end of this year. And then we'll be forecasting like targets you want to do for yourself in terms of setting your own goals. And we might even whip out one of the modules on setting a SMART goal so that you can think about what is the thing that I want to do like over the summer or during my rec and leisure time. And just know that we greatly appreciate your commitment, not even just to figuring out what works for kids with the most intensive intervention needs, but just the whole systems piece. And I love the way you are focused on a system that is healthy for the kids and involves the family and is healthy for the adults. And I think that's one of the strengths of CI3T. Families are at the table with kids during the building process. And in the perfect world, family members continue all through implementation. It is a partnership. We're not coming in to say we need to do these 98 things to your kid. We're having this conversation about the data suggests that maybe what we're doing right now may not be enough, even though it's in place with Fidelity, and we're committed to meeting your child's multiple needs. And if we don't know how to do it yet, just like Wendy said, if there's room for us to grow, we'll figure it out. So if you decide to come for that last session, I encourage you to bring a calendar, whether it's your personal calendar, a digital calendar, an academic calendar for your school year. And I really want you to be able to see like what's coming next. And we might have some fun mapping out a professional learning journey for yourself. And Grant Allen, who I deeply appreciate and respect, continues for many years now to coordinate these monthly CI3T trainer and coaches calls. And so this is a wonderful place to come see many of you that are here right now and meet other new partners. We have been hearing from some people that have lately been hearing from you, and they're reaching out just to say, how do we get in on those opportunities for free professional learning and accesses to resources? It's also a place to drop in to say things like, our internalizing issues are higher than they ever have been. What should I do? And as Eric's mentioning in the chat right now, the last few months of these are all intended to help people close out the school year, and we're not giving up. And remember that March and December are the 2 months of every year that have the highest spikes in office discipline referral. So you're in the thick of it right now. Leanne's eyebrows just went up, so she's feeling better about what's happening in her school. So just know that there's resources and we can help you with that. And so when we're back together next time, it will be that wrap up and close up, but not give up. And so please know that we're looking forward to that time with you. Rebecca has been the queen of scheduling with wonderful people like Stacy and Nettie, and we've got dates set up for next year. So when we're together in session 6, we'll also be telling you when all the new empowers are happening, and we'll let you know which of the low intensity supports would be featured, what the tier 2 supports will be featured, and we're really looking forward to that time with you. And we will also have hot at that time the next registration for Empower, so that if you did want to start to have people register, we'd love for that opportunity. So as we close out, Rebecca's just going to give us a quick reminder about the reason why we asked for these evaluations at the end of the session.
Oh, that's a very nice setup. Thanks. We really appreciate you all being here. We know you've got a ton going on, so we love learning from and with you. So if you would just take a quick minute to fill out the session out eval, it'll help us as we get ready for closing out the year with the next session, and then also as we plan for what's coming next year. So we would greatly appreciate your feedback. And it came from me, Rebecca Sherrod, at around 6:45.
Thank you so much.
Central.
Thanks so much for the gift of your time, and thanks to especially those on the East Coast for being here so late. So I appreciate you. Have a wonderful evening. Be safe, and we look forward to hearing what you're using. I'll talk to you soon. Be safe.